Two dreadful doll stories. Don't Take My Doll. It was July the 2nd in 1998 when she first appeared. A slight pale woman with large black rings around her eyes, thin, hollow cheekbones, and hair like matted wire. I watched from the front desk every day as she flitted up to the window, stared into the police station, and repeatedly tapped her bony fingers against the glass. I've been drafted to the small seaside town of Gentry less than a month ago, and not a day had gone by without the woman appearing at the window, sometimes for hours on end. I'd asked a couple of my superiors what she was doing, but they merely avoided my eyes and told me not to pry into private affairs. Today was no different. The woman crept over to the window and danced her fingers across the glass. The sky outside grew dark as the hours dragged on, and I watched as the first drops of rain fell from the sky. The light drizzle quickly progressed into a downpour, and I observed as the woman went from being doused to being drenched in a matter of minutes. Yet her movements didn't cease, and she continued to tap fervently on the window, her hollow, maddening wide eyes fixed on me the entire time. When her hair began to literally melt out of its precarious bun, I pushed back my chair and walked over to the door. I hesitated for a moment, glancing tentatively behind me to make sure that all eyes were averted. Quickly, I wrenched open the door and stuck my head outside and called, "Hey, do you want to come inside until the weather calms down?" The woman froze and snapped her head towards me. I was startled by her movement. The angle of her head made it appear that she possessed no spine to speak of, and instead, her head was disconnected from her neck. A near-complete rotation without her moving her shoulders. I couldn't suppress a shiver as she twisted her body to align with her head and began to creep towards me, her arms lying limply at her sides. I stepped aside to allow her inside, and she twisted her head in that inhuman state to face me. We stood like that for a painfully long few seconds before she whispered, "I have a crime to report." Her voice was delicate and childlike, as though encased within the putrescent gray skin and bedraggled hair lay a sweet child with pink ribbons scattered in her blonde ringlets. Of course, ma'am," I smiled, gesturing for her to follow me to the front desk. I'd barely taken a step before she clasped her fingers around my wrist, her cold skin creating a crushing vice that stopped me in my tracks. "Please, ma'am, could we go to the back room?" Her question surprised me a bit, but I could understand why some witnesses would be too scared to declare crimes in the open. I had never heard of any witnesses being relocated to an actual room in the time I'd spent at the station, but the itching desire to know more about the woman prompted me to nod and change course, heading down a long, thin corridor to the tiny back room. As we walked, I stole a glance back at her and noticed that she was a fair deal younger than I'd first assumed. Her slender limbs, hunched figure, and dark eyes made it appear that she was an elderly woman, but on closer inspection, her undeveloped physique and smooth face suggested that she was most likely a prepubescent child. I was shocked at myself for not noticing this sooner, that I almost strolled headfirst into the door of the back room. Halting in the nick of time, I fumbled my keys before unlocking the room and stepping inside. The room was comprised of dark metal walls and a concrete floor, complete with a stainless steel table and 2 chairs. I took the chair closest to the door and waited for the girl to sit down. I pulled out a recording tape from my bag and set it on the table. "Okay," I smiled. "Go ahead." The girl's dark eyes stared into my brown ones, and she let her jaw grow slack. After a moment, however, she began. It began like every other day. The sun rose, the tide ebbed from the shore, and the seaside town stuttered into life. However, this day was special. Wait a second, please, I interrupted. You don't have to tell it to me like this, like a story. I mean, you can just tell me the key elements and I can submit a report. She fixed on me with her intense stare and replied, But this is how it goes. I have to tell the story how it goes. I sighed and waved her on, not in the mood to argue with a child. She continued, It was a special day because it happened to be the birthday of the mayor's daughter, Cecilia Abigail Townsend. Her mother had promised Cecilia that she could ask for anything she wanted, so the little girl had replied, a doll. So Cecilia's mother went searching for the most beautiful china doll in the town. She looked in the quaint boutiques and upmarket district stores, but she found no doll worthy of her beautiful daughter. Finally, she found a little girl playing on the street, a cherubic doll clasped in her hands. She begged and pleaded with the little girl to part with the doll, but the child would have none of it. As the child played on, steely clouds rolled in from the ocean, threatening a storm. Finally, the girl set the doll on a nearby bench while she went in to fetch an umbrella from her house, which lay only a few yards from where she was playing. Taking her chance, the mother snatched the doll from the bench and ran home, not stopping once along the way. She arrived home and wrapped the doll before presenting it to the delighted Cecilia that night. Cecilia, however, received a great number of presents that night, and the little doll was forgotten amongst the onslaught of gifts. Cecilia bade her parents good night and left for bed as the moon rose in the sky. Her father soon followed her, but her mother was left to clean up the mess that the wrapping paper had created. It was only when she had completely tidied the kitchen that she noticed the doll sitting on Cecilia's chair, its glassy eyes staring straight ahead. Cecilia's mother had been sure that the doll had been discarded under the table earlier, and no one had repositioned it on the chair, unless it had somehow climbed up there itself. Scared by her own musings, Cecilia's mother switched off the lights and retired for the night. When the clock struck midnight, Cecilia Abigail Townsend awoke to a small voice whispering in her room. Cecilia, I'm in the front hall. Cecilia slipped out of bed and padded to the front hall, which led from the kitchen to the grand staircase. The doll was lying on the carpet, its gaze directed at Cecilia, who stood at the top of the staircase. Thinking perhaps her brother was performing some sort of trick on her, Cecilia shook her head and walked back to her bedroom. But the voice returned. Cecilia, I'm on the stairs. I'm on the first step. I'm on the second step. I'm on the third step. The voice continued until the very last step on the grand staircase. Cecilia crept outside to check, and, sure enough, the doll was lying at the top of the stairs, its hollow eyes staring straight at her. Truly frightened now, Cecilia ran to her room, locked the door, and dove under the covers. And still the voice continued. Cecilia, I'm in your brother's room. There was a sudden scream of agony, followed by the sound of a body hitting the floor. Got him. Cecilia began to cry, her teeth tearing through her bottom lip as the voice went on. Cecilia, I'm in your parents' room. Another set of screams followed. Got them. Cecilia listened in horror as her lock clicked and the door swung open. Cecilia, I'm at your toes. I'm at your knees. I'm at your waist. I'm at your shoulder. Stop! I yelled, slamming my hands down on the table. The girl didn't look taken aback in the least by my outburst, instead gazing at me as though waiting to continue. I demand you stop this right now, I growled. This is a police station, not a campfire, and I will have none of your tales here. I know very well that today is the mayor's daughter's birthday and that they are all alive at this moment. So please, kindly stop wasting my time and... I was interrupted by the doors bursting open and the chief sergeant leaning in, policemen dashing backwards and forwards behind him. Detective, we need you at Mayor Townsend's residence. Please come with me. I looked back to the chair and saw that the little girl had slipped behind me and out the door while my attention had been preoccupied. Gritting my teeth in frustration, I turned back to the chief and nodded, following back through the station and into the sheeting rain. When we arrived at the mayor's house, the coroners were removing gurneys laden with bodies covered in blood-spattered sheets. One of the sheets was blown back in the wind, and I saw the mutilated face of Cecilia Townsend, her throat slashed into ribbons of flesh, and her mouth slit from ear to ear in a horrific grin. I felt bile rise in my throat and excused myself to empty my stomach behind the house. I was wiping my mouth when I heard a light tapping, even through the rain. I glanced up and I saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, its fingers splayed across the glass. Squinting, I could make out the outline of the girl from the police station, a large smile upon her usually deadpan face, and a doll with blonde ringlets clutched in her hand. She tapped on the glass again and began to write something on the window. When she finished, she waved at me, her smile growing impossibly huge, before disappearing into the room's shadows. I stepped closer and saw the words daubed on the window in blood-red letters. "Don't take my doll." The Doll Cemetery. They called it the Doll Cemetery. It was a small valley, barren and deserted, behind a hill that hid it from the sight of the town. Nothing grew on its arid soil. The few trees that had tried were long dead, turned into wooden skeletons that stretched their hooked fingers to the sky above. The reason for the name was clear to anyone who visited the place. It had indeed the grim and gloomy air of an old cemetery, completely uncomforting. However, its guests were not underground, neither walled in narrow recesses. They stood in plain sight, fully exposed to eyes in the weather. There were dolls of every kind and size, of every fashion, style, and era. Ancient misses with painted porcelain faces whose richly embroidered dresses were now reduced to moldy rags. Cheap rag dolls, or what was left of them, their smiles faded but still visible on their deformed, swollen faces. Elegant catwalk models 10 inches tall, who once possessed clothes and accessories, now stood naked and twisted into unlikely poses. Child dolls that had once walked, cried, and called for their mommies, now laid motionless, silent, often mutilated. Some of those that had been there longer were stuck to the ground or tied to the trees with iron wires, now corroded by rust, or with ribbons and string that time had worn and faded. Most, though, had simply been left on the ground, and many of them had been pushed around by the wind or rain, gathering in some hollow, as if in a sad common grave. No one knew who had placed the first doll there, or why. Even for the eldest of the town, it was a question without an answer. But somehow it had started a sort of tradition. There were still girls who, forced to separate from their favorite doll, passed beyond by any chance of repair, asked for her to be brought there among her peers. But doing it was a task for parents, because no child ever ventured there, not even for a dare. The doll cemetery was a grim and sad place, even in the full light of a summer day. But in the night, or even worse, in one of those dull days threatening rain, when clouds cast a gray light over the whole place, it was impossible to walk through it and not be overwhelmed by a feeling of anguish, as if each of those little abandoned bodies hosted a soul, silently screaming all of its torment into the ears of the living. Like any respectable graveyard, the doll cemetery had a caretaker, Or at least that's what the old homeless man who had found shelter in the badly assembled shack right in the middle of the valley was said to be. They said during the day he walked around the place, whispering incomprehensible words to the dolls, as if to comfort them, and that at night he went back into his shack and, behind the window, or in the doorframe in the hot summer nights, stood vigilant as if protecting a sacred place from whatever intruder. The townsfolk believed he was crazy, but harmless, especially because he never left the valley, and whoever wanted to find him always knew where he was. But, in truth, nobody ever wanted to find him. At least, until the girls disappeared. They were 3 friends, 15 years old, always together since nursery school. Once teens, they spent more time together than with their respective families, from the morning meeting to go to school to the late evening goodbyes to go to sleep. Unless they managed to do that together as well, with short and infrequent interruptions for meals. The day when their parents could not find them in their rooms, their first thought was that they had secretly left, maybe by the window, to get together and do some of their mischief. It wouldn't have been the first time. When they weren't back for lunch or dinner, and late at night none of the houses they could go back to had seen them come, worry started to spread in their families, and soon in the whole town. They thought about an accident, something so serious that they weren't even able to call. Groups of volunteers were formed, and they searched for the girls everywhere, in the town and around it. But they didn't go behind the hill. Why should they? It was only when none of them brought back any news that the mother of one of the 3 remembered, shocked, what her daughter had told her a week, maybe 10 days ago, failing to elicit her attention. What she had said about the caretaker of the doll cemetery. He had molested them, or so the girl had said to the mother that didn't care to listen at the time, knowing her daughter was going through a phase where she frequently made up unbelievable stories to feed her lust for attention. He had approached them late at night, she had explained. He had tried to make them follow him. He had tried to touch them, but they had fled. When parents of the second girl said they had heard nothing of that, they accused the poor woman, dumping the blame on her for what might have happened. They aroused the spirits of their neighbors and declared themselves ready to tear that shack down, if that could help find their daughter. But for the father of the 3rd girl, a widower with a meek face and large body, the report had been no news. His daughter, also, had told him the same thing, but it couldn't have happened. That man never went into the town, everybody knew, and the girl had sworn she had never set foot in the cemetery. Clearly, it must be a misunderstanding, maybe a prank, he kept repeating. Going there would just be a waste of time. No one listened to him. They accused him of being a craven, of not caring about his daughter's fate. After all, when had he ever cared? Always away for work, with the poor girl left to her own devices? And then the pressure that had been on the woman shifted to him. She might have been shallow, but he was a man. He ought to have done something, immediately, before the worst had happened. His words and his apparent attempts to clear the homeless man's name were worth nothing, except maybe to exacerbate the people even more. A compact group of men, armed with the wrath they deemed right and with bad intentions, joined the parents of the girls to go to the doll cemetery, in the unshakable belief that the girls would be found there. And they were. The first one, who had said nothing to her parents, had been tied to a tree with iron wire. Her arms open wide to the heavens, her calm face, her head dangling forward on her broken neck. She looked like an angel who wanted to keep vigil on that place of death, now real. Cries of rage rose from the crowd, who started to march faster. Still, even before such evidence, the widower kept saying that it was impossible, that the caretaker couldn't have done that. The second girl was halfway to the center of the valley. She was sat on the ground, her back leaning on a trunk, her arms limp at her sides. Her ears had been ripped away from her head violently, and rivulets of blood painted her face, running down her cheeks. A fabric ribbon that maybe had once been light green had been tied over her mouth. It would have been a poor gag if she had still been able to talk. The dramatically belated rescuers started to run. Maybe there was still a chance to save the last girl, even though her very father, surely out of his mind by now, was shouting for them to stop and to stay away from the shack. And there, on the door, they found the last one, the widower's daughter. She had been thrown to the ground with no regard in a tangled heap. Her face was livid and bloody, her clothes marked by little round stains. Her mouth was open in a wide scream she would never be able to utter, because her tongue lied aside in a pool of blood that looked like some beast had walked on it. But for sure, no beast, not a real one, had done that to her. No one wanted to hear anything else. The shouted ramblings of the widower got lost in those of the crowd, inciting itself to avenge the girls. The man stepped back as someone kicked down the door of the shack. Then everybody else did the same when the stench coming from within assaulted them like a living beast, as if it had been lurking in wait behind those weak planks. No revenge would ever take place. The caretaker of the doll cemetery lied lifeless on the floor of what had been his home. His skin was livid and his body swollen, and a pool of dried blood surrounded his head like a macabre halo. He had been dead for days. Silence suddenly fell on the crowd. Nothing could be heard except the gulps of those who had lost their daughters, and the flutter of the wings of some bird, or maybe the sound of small footsteps moving away. Glances were exchanged, full of questions nobody wanted to speak and answers nobody wanted to hear. Then, all eyes converged on the only one who had never wanted to go there, who was now slowly walking away, looking down, clutching his chest with his hands. They saw him stumble toward the hill, then suddenly stop to free the hem of his trousers from the hand of a doll that must have gotten stuck to it. They saw him tremble as he shook his leg, as if in a panic, then turn around and disappear behind the hill at a brisk step. From that day, nobody set foot in the doll cemetery ever again.